Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Drupal for Gov's August webinar on future-proofing for Drupal 9, which will be presented by Mike Madison from Acquia. One of our most popular events is coming up in less than 5 weeks, Drupal GovCon. It's held September 24th through the 25th. Our volunteer team has been working hard. In addition to working from home, multitasking, and remaining sane, we're trying to come up with something that we think we will give everyone the same quality of programming that we're used to from GovCon in a convenient virtual format. So for more information and to keep up to date, visit drupalgovcon.org. And also please note that all of these items that I'm mentioning will be listed either in our Zoom chat or in the Gov Drupal Slack, the Future Proof 2020 Slack channel. Before we begin, some housekeeping. Most of you all are familiar with us. We're Drupal for Gov, a community of open source advocates interested in all things open source. So as mentioned earlier, our biggest event held in almost 5 weeks, Drupal GovCon. So we begin with the training day that starts September 23rd. And then our conference actually kicks off September 24th through the 25th. We also hold global training days, also known as half-day training days. But we'll be able to do these again when we return to the office. But if you're interested, please contact us via our email, drupalforgov@gmail.com. And we also are available on Slack and Twitter. So if you're interested in revisiting a past webinar, subscribe to our YouTube channel and you'll be able to view our past webinars. All of our videos are also captured by the Drupal Recording Initiative and Drupal's TV curated playlist. And I have to give a special thanks to our combined Drupal GovCon and Baltimore Drupal Camp sponsors. We couldn't pull off this event without them. So for those who are interested, there's still time to become a sponsor. So check out our sponsors page on Drupal GovCon for more information, and you can also visit and check out our perspective. Also, in addition to the sponsors, we can't pull this off. We are 100% volunteer run. If you're interested in volunteering, please visit our volunteer form. And I believe you can find it under our main navigation under programs. And lastly, finally, today's webinar is Future Proofing for Drupal 9. So Mike Madison is our speaker. He's a Seattle-based Drupal architect with over 15 years of experience using open source technologies such as Drupal, WordPress, and Media Wiki. He also he's a manager on Acquia's professional services team, where he helps enterprise, government, and higher education customers implement Drupal and other technologies. He also contributes to the Drupal for Gov as a tech lead, and he volunteers for the Drupal GovCon conference, and he's a former maintainer of Acquia's build and launch tools, BLT. Without further ado, Mike.
Thank you, Nika. Let me say hello to everybody and try to share my screen. You may need to make me a co-host so I can share. While we're waiting for that, I see some familiar faces in the room, and there's over 65 of you here. So thank you all for joining live, and for those that watch in the future. Really excited to talk to you about this topic today. I had a chance to do a similar presentation at Acquia Engage last year, and it was well received. So hopefully you all enjoy. As Nika said, I'm Mike Madison. and I'm a manager on Acquia's professional services team. Prior to being at Acquia, I was actually working for a Department of Energy national laboratory here in Washington State, which is how I came to be involved with the government Drupal group, and I've been very happy to continue being involved with this group for many years, even now that I'm still at Acquia. If you don't already follow me on Twitter, please do. I post a lot of content, usually a couple times a week, related to stuff like we're going to be talking about today. So if you enjoy what you see and hear, and you want to see and hear more of it, please do chase me down either on my blog or on Twitter. Would love to connect with you in the future. So during this webinar today, we're going to cover a couple of topics all around future-proofing, and this is a 2-hour webinar. So I certainly know that is not a short period of time. We are planning a short break at the around the 1-hour mark. We'll also do some quick Q&A in that section, and then we'll move on for the final half and do a longer Q&A, assuming we have time and interest at the end. If you do have questions, please go ahead and post them into the Slack chat. If you happen to be watching live on YouTube, you can always post those questions on the Gov Drupal Slack in the Future Proof 2020 room, and we will have a look at those when we get to the QA times. So let's talk first about why are we here, and specifically why future proofing is important. If you haven't been paying attention, that's okay. There's been a few things going on this year, but there are some really important dates that you as a Drupalist need to be aware of. So obviously Drupal 9 was released a couple months ago. I am actively building one project right now on Drupal 9 and have updated a couple of other projects. We'll look at least one of those here in this webinar. Drupal 7's end of life was originally scheduled for November 2021, but because of COVID, that has actually been bumped out a full year to November 2022. But Drupal 8's end of life is still scheduled for next November because of Symfony 3's end of life. And if you're not already in whiplash from Drupal 9 coming out, Drupal 10 is currently scheduled to come out in June of 2022. And this can be a little scary, right? Especially if you're still on Drupal 6, Drupal 7, which you know, that's okay. Don't panic. That's why we're here. But obviously, with these dates and with these changes coming, you know, we need to acknowledge the truth of the matter, right? And the truth of the matter is that, you know, of the reported Drupal installs, and again, this is reported, not all. Of the roughly 1 million sites reported to be using Drupal between versions 5 and 9.1, I'm very skeptical of this number, by the way, since 9.1 hasn't actually released yet. Roughly 60% of those reported sites are still running Drupal 7. And that means that within the next roughly 2 years, you need to make a choice, right? Either you're going to maintain your relationship with Drupal 7 beyond the end of community support, and there are going to be a number of vendors, I believe Acquia is one, that will offer paid support for beyond the end of life of Drupal 7, or you need to upgrade, and you need to move into either Drupal 8 or Drupal 9, or you know, by that point, Drupal 10. And this is not an insignificant number of sites, right?
So
that's a lot.
Are you sharing your slides? I don't know. I passed over. I want to make sure you know you have.
Can you not see my screen? Hopefully you've got,
okay.
Do you have my screen?
Yeah. I can't see it, but can other people see his screen? Okay, I see it, sorry.
I see it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. I was going to say, thank you. That would have been awkward if you just got my face for 2 hours. Thank you for saying something. So as I was saying, this does mean that there's a change coming for you, right? Hopefully that change is not you're going to start paying for Drupal, right? Hopefully that change is you are going to start this journey of upgrading to something. right? And if you're already running Drupal 8, which again, statistically, I assume some of you on this call are, cool. That's going to be a relatively small change to jump from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9. That's the goal, right? That's why Drupal 8 is such a big change from Drupal 7, because we don't ever want you to have to do that big change again. If you're on Drupal 7, there's going to be a much larger change. So during this webinar today, we are going to be talking about sort of what this upgrade process means for you if you're on Drupal 7, and also what it means for Drupal 8. A lot of those things are the same. And in this first hour, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking specifically about both Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, and then we'll move on to general things. But I do want to prepare you, right? Eventually, once you're off Drupal 7, once you're running Drupal 8, Drupal 9, you should plan on doing a major platform upgrade, a major version update of Drupal every couple of years. If you look at the release schedule of Drupal, Drupal 9 just came out, Drupal 10 comes out in a couple of years. Again, much smaller upgrade than it would be if you were going from Drupal 7 to 8. 8 to 9 is literally you just do an update and it's done. It's no big deal. But this is potentially kind of scary for some organizations, right? Especially if you're still running Drupal 6, Drupal 7 several years after Drupal 8 came out. So adopting a much more rapid upgrade cadence becomes very important. And this is why future-proofing is so important, right? The idea of future-proofing your platform is all about looking ahead, recognizing there's a change coming, and because of that, we need to do things to make sure that when we make those changes, we don't accidentally break our production website. We don't accidentally bring down our production website, right? We want to make sure that those major upgrades can be handled as easily as changing a permission or adding a new view or updating a content type, right? So these are the topics that we're going to be talking about today. And given where we're at in the Drupal community right now, there are one of three scenarios that folks are going to fall broadly into, right? The first is that you're still running Drupal 7 or some older version of Drupal. Number two is that you're already running Drupal 8, somewhere between 8.0 and 8.9. And number three, you're already running Drupal 9. And if you're in a future-proofing webinar and you're already running Drupal 9, you are well ahead of the curve. Congratulations to you. There's still going to be some good info here because you'll eventually have to upgrade to Drupal 10. So let's start very quickly and talk about what it means if you're running Drupal 7 or below. Unfortunately, there is no upgrade path from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. And what that means is that you can't just like hot swap out your files like you would upgrading a major or a minor version of Drupal 7, right? You can't just go from like Drupal 7.4.1 or whatever is current to Drupal 8. You have to go start a completely new code base with a completely new database and rebuild everything. You can do a migration of your data or your content once you've rebuilt, which is good. And there are also some products out there that are either already available or forthcoming, like Acquia's new Migrate Accelerator, that will help you somewhat automate that migration and upgrade process. But at the end of the day, this is expect this to be a rebuild. And I'll tell you right now, like if you're still running Drupal 7 today, there's a really good chance that you should just skip Drupal 8. Right, if you're doing this right now, I would really seriously just look at going directly to Drupal 9, unless there's a really good reason not to, and we'll talk more about that. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this because this is not an Acquia webinar. But if you happen to be an Acquia customer, or if you're an Acquia customer in the future, you should definitely look into this option if you're still running Drupal 7. We are trying to help you migrate out of Drupal 7 into Drupal 9 a little faster and easier. WebCheck did a presentation at DrupalCon Global this year on this. I don't think those presentations have been posted yet, but if you're interested, keep an eye out. You can get into more information about that later. If you're on Drupal 8, I have really good news for you, especially if you're already running Drupal 8.9. Drupal 8.9 and Drupal 9.0 are basically identical. The update from 8.9 to 9.0 has a few database updates, not significant ones. The two things that are more significant, all the deprecated code goes away. We'll look at what that means in a moment. And there are some really major dependency updates that happen, specifically Symfony updates from 3 to Symfony 4. So otherwise, you're not really gaining any features and functionality in Drupal 9.0. Now, you will be as of Drupal 9.1. So if you're currently running Drupal 8 and you're thinking about updating to Drupal 9, my general recommendation is try to get that done before December of this year, so a couple more months, just because in the next couple months, you're not losing anything. You're not missing out on anything between Drupal 8.9 and Drupal 9. Once Drupal 9.1 comes out, though, you will start missing out on the new features and functionality of Drupal 9.1. And again, I want to just really stress that updating in Drupal 8.9 to Drupal 9, you don't have to do any data migration. You don't have to rebuild anything. If you're using Composer, you're literally like Composer update Drupal core, and it'll just bump up to Drupal 9, deploy, and you're done, right? A few database updates, no big deal. So good to know if you're already on Drupal 8. So let's talk about some high-level recommendations for both of these systems. So we're gonna start and do some high-level recommendations for Drupal 7, and then we will do some high-level recommendations for Drupal 8. So if you're running Drupal 7 and you're getting ready to go do a Drupal 8 or Drupal 9 upgrade, like I said a moment ago, this is largely a rebuild. So you should treat this upgrade like you would any other rebuild. You should look at your current site. You should think about what features and functionality you have in your site. Is there anything there that's redundant? That could be redundant content types. We've got an example of that in a minute. That could be some funky views that, over time have just kind of become crufty and not perhaps the most straightforward to manage or maintain. You're going to want to build an inventory of your Contrib modules. Obviously, Contrib is in various states between Drupal 7 and Drupal 9. So understanding what modules are you using today, what modules are you going to be using in the future, and then building an inventory of your custom code. And again, we'll talk more about this here in a moment. Think about your governance process. This is something I always like to talk about because as an architect, I have learned over and over and over again that it doesn't matter if you have all the right technology in place. It doesn't matter if you have the most brilliant developers in the world. If you have a crap governance process, the technology doesn't matter, right? So think about how you're managing your people. Think about how you're managing your tasks. Think about how things get done on your current platform, right? If somebody comes to your team and makes a demand or makes a request, what is the process from which, hey, I want something, to there it is on the website? Do you have an approval structure in place? Do you have a requirements gathering mechanism in place? And perhaps most important, do you have some sort of executive sponsor or approving team that can come in and work with you, the technical team, to help prioritize and identify what features coming in are appropriate on your platform? Some of the most complex and complicated builds that I've worked on in my career are actually not that complicated technically. They're hard because of the people involved and the egos involved and the personalities involved, and trying to sort through, I have to have this as a request, and we don't do anything like that right now technically. That can really bring you to an impasse. So again, if you're going to completely throw the baby out with the bathwater and start over in Drupal 8 or 9, this is a really good opportunity not just to think about what do we have in our site technically today, but how do we govern our process? How do we manage our team? How do we work with our stakeholders? And is that relationship healthy? Next, we want to think about standardizing and adopting best practices. We're actually going to talk about this quite a bit later in the webinar today. But there are some really significant changes between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 and 9. Dependency management, configuration management, object-oriented PHP. These are all things that weren't really a thing in Drupal 7, and they're a big thing in Drupal 8. So if you don't have best practices surrounding these things, if you don't have skills personally or amongst your team around these things, that's okay. I didn't either. But you're going to want these things before you jump headfirst into Drupal 8 and Drupal 9. They're less trivial, perhaps, than you might think. Is Composer itself hard? No. Is building a workflow that everybody on your team can use, that works with CI/CD, that works in your deployment process, trivial? It depends if you've done it before or not. If you're starting completely from scratch, no, it's probably going to take some time to get that up and running. So again, standardizing around these technologies and adopting best practices around them, that's something you can do today, even if you're not ready to pull the trigger and actually start doing updating. Think about your testing protocols. Again, we're going to talk about testing later in the webinar. But remember, anytime you're doing a significant update to a platform, that update can break something. So what is your testing procedure to make sure that we're at a known state today that works? We're going to go update to Drupal 8.9.4 whenever that comes out. How do we make sure that that update doesn't break something really important? Obviously, automated testing is more robust, but if you don't have automated testing, a manual testing protocol is still a testing protocol, and it's better than praying as you deploy that things are going to work out. So think about what your testing protocol is and explore that. So let's talk about preparing to do the update if you're running Drupal 7. So again, as I said a moment ago, in an ideal world, treat this like a brand new project, right? Let's pretend nothing is going on your current web presence. Let's pretend it doesn't even exist for a moment. Engage your stakeholders. Review the requirements. Think about what should our website be doing? What should the user experience be like? What features and functionalities should we have? And yes, of course, we should look at what we really have today, especially because of the quantity of content I know many government websites have. We're not going to just like burn that down. But again, this is a really good opportunity to start fresh and do it the right way. There's something really cathartic about having a project or having a platform or having a site that you've been maintaining for 3 years, 5 years, however many years. And there's all this stuff building up in it that you wish you could fix, you wish you could do different if you have the opportunity. Well, here's your opportunity to really look at that and analyze, how are we going to do this right? Because again, you have to rebuild it anyway. Take advantage of that. Develop architecture. Think about, based on our requirements, what is the best way to do the thing that we want to do? And then ultimately build and test the site. And it's really easy to say, hey, we've got a site, let's just go rebuild it. Let's just go take what we've got right now, and we're just going to go dump it into Drupal 8 or 9. That'll work, right? If you're on a deadline, if you have a small budget, like that's an option. But I guarantee you, if you take the time to do these first 3 things before you start building, your end result is going to be better. Let's talk about reviewing your old site. So, like I said, gather requirements as if you don't have an old site, but you still have an old site, right? So there's going to be things here that we can learn. As I said, look for redundancies, build an inventory of contrib modules, build an inventory of custom code. We talked about this a little bit. So let's dig into those. So what redundancies do you have on your current site? And by the way, even if you're on Drupal 8, this could be a thing you do at some point. Ask yourself, do I still need everything that I've got on this platform? Wow, this is a 6-year-old site. We have 300 contrib modules. We have 25 content types, whatever. Like, do you use all that stuff? Does it make sense? Also keep in mind that in Drupal 8, the entity system is significantly better. It's significantly expanded beyond what it was in prior versions of Drupal. So there are things that you had to do in kind of a weird, funky way with content types in Drupal 7 that you absolutely can do with content bundles or entities in Drupal 8 and 9. So custom blocks, you can do custom plugins, you can build your own custom entities. Web form is actually a great example. In Drupal 7, web forms are kind of this weird, funky content type. In Drupal 8, web forms, and Drupal 9, web forms are actually a completely custom content entity called web form. So they don't go into your content types at all. They're not nodes, they're web forms. With Drupal 8 and 9, you also have Layout Builder in core, which gives you a lot of power to do bespoke content pages, one-off pages that use different custom blocks and different custom layouts. You can actually build some really powerful user experiences using custom blocks and Layout Builder. So, if you have carousels and banners and accordions and tabs and all these other components that you want to use on your site, you build those as blocks and then you use Layout Builder. So again, a lot of new exciting stuff in Drupal 8 and 9. And this is why I'm saying, look for redundancies, take time to review your content architecture. Because if you just go and rebuild the same content architecture in Drupal 8, exactly like it was Drupal 9, exactly like it was in Drupal 7, you're gonna miss out on so many of the powerful enhancements the community has been hard at work on for years. So don't just jump without taking some time to look at this. So this is an example content architecture that I actually ran into with a real customer. It actually happened to be a government customer. So for them, in their Drupal 7 site, they had 5 content types that were all in some way referred to as articles. They had sort of a normal article that was used to populate just articles. They had news articles that were used to populate their news page, which also tied into their mobile app for like news alerts. And then they had an exact copy of the base article content type, except there was a version that embedded a map, there was another version that embedded an iframe, and there was yet again another version that added like a table into the article. So options 1, 3, 4, and 5 were basically all identical article content types, just with these extra couple of fields for the map, iframe, and table. And as we're talking about, for them, moving to Drupal 8, this was a while ago, we're talking about this going, whoa, hold on, like there's no reason to build 5 basically identical content types in Drupal 8. Like build one, build an article content type. And then let's use the other tools at our disposal to actually wire this up in a simpler way. So in this case, we started with 5 content types, and what we end up with is 5 entity bundles or content bundles. But in this case, it's going to be, again, the base article content type. That base article content type would use Layout Builder so that you can add custom blocks to the layout of that article. We'd create 3 custom block types, one for a map, one for the iframe, one for the table. And then we'd also use just the vocabulary taxonomy system to actually tag the type of article that we're creating. So if we have just a base article, a news article, whatever else. So at the end of the day, we're still doing 5 to 5, right? We're talking about 5 things to 5 things. But if you think about what those 5 things are, these now become much more powerful things, right? Because we have 1 content type to maintain. We have 3 custom block types that could be used other places, right? We're not limiting maps just to article maps. If you want to map on a basic page, if you want to map in the footer or wherever, right? We've built out this map functionality, and now it can be used and embedded anywhere throughout your site. Gives you a lot more options doing it this way. And you can still migrate data from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9, Drupal 8 in this sort of content architecture. It's just not going to be going directly from one thing to the new thing named exactly as it was. The other thing I wanted to recommend here while you're thinking about your content architecture is to use a spec sheet. And if you're not familiar with the Drupal spec tool, this is free. You don't have to be at all associated with Acquia to use this, although we've open sourced it and made it available for you. But what the spec tool does is it lets you define all of the bundles, all of the content bundles that you're going to be building on your website. So this is a brand new one for Drupal 9. This assumes you're using Acquia Lightning. So these are all of the bundles that come with Lightning out of the box. And then you can go in and define all of your fields for those bundles. So, if we're going to do an article, as an example, you add the new article bundle as a content type, and then you go into your fields and add in all of the fields that you need for your article bundle. The spec tool becomes really powerful with a team because you can actually share this with your team as part of your ticket building requirements. It generates some really spiffy stuff, like it'll automatically generate BHAT tests for you based on your content architecture. If you need diagrams for your content architecture to put into documentation, like an architecture doc or a presentation, it actually will just take your content architecture with all the entity references and help you render that diagram for you. Basically, any site building that you're doing here, views, menus, workflows, you name it, you can put everything in here. And I highly, highly recommend that you use this. Again, it's free, and treat it like scripture, right? If you keep this up to date, if everybody lives and dies by this thing, it becomes really, really, really easy to keep track of your requirements in your site building. Moving on to the next topic, let's talk about Drupal 7 Contrib. Not all of Drupal 7 Contrib is ready for Drupal 9, stable, needed for Drupal 9, or actually a thing anymore. So what I mean by that, let's start at the bottom and work our way up. So in Drupal 7, there was this really useful module called admin menu. I used it, it's great. In Drupal 8, there is a different module called admin toolbar. Same idea, right? But not the same module. Views. If you built a Drupal 7 site and you didn't use views, I would love to hear how you did that someday. Well, you don't need views technically anymore as a module because it ships with Drupal core as of Drupal 8. So the views module is not a thing anymore. It's just part of Drupal. Rules. I did a lot with rules in Drupal 7. I have not yet built a Drupal 8 site or Drupal 9 site using rules. It's much more stable today than it was initially, but it's still in an alpha or a beta state for Drupal 8 and 9. And the libraries module is another one that does technically work with Drupal 8, but it's not actually ready for D9 because there's some stuff that's been done in Drupal core that more or less does what libraries did for Drupal 7 and 8. So looking at your modules, all of your modules, and I'm sorry for some of you that may be a really painful, traumatic experience looking through all the modules you have on your sites, but you gotta go through and figure out, what is this? Is it enabled? Am I using it? What are we using it for? And once you know the answer to all that stuff, you need to go out and see, what the heck am I going to do with this thing in Drupal 9? And thankfully, the answer will sometimes be, well, we just don't need this thing anymore, right? Like it could very well be that you're doing this thing, it may be a thing that you just don't need anymore, but you want to know that going in. We're going to talk a lot more about this when we get to the Drupal 8 section in a few minutes, because this is an even bigger deal, believe it or not, for those of you running Drupal 8. So yeah, here are the questions, like I was just saying. I also just want to really, really draw attention to this. Your priority should be always use what's in core first. If what I need is not in core, then go to Contrib. And if the thing that I don't need is, or the thing that I do need is not available from the community in Contrib. Okay, fine. Then you can build it custom. But you should not be just jumping immediately to custom. That just makes your maintenance footprint blow up, and you just don't want to do that if you can avoid it, because custom is not an insignificant amount of effort to maintain. We do want to talk a little bit about custom code while we're here. Custom code is a little different in Drupal 8 and 9 than it was in Drupal 6 and 7. In Drupal 6, in Drupal 7, there was basically a hook for everything, right? Defining a thing, changing a thing, updating a thing, it's all a hook. That's just not the case in Drupal 8 and 9. Some things are hooks, but most things aren't, actually. There's a heavy reliance on object-oriented PHP. There's a really robust plugin system. Like, I remember the code sample I actually sent to Acquia when I applied for my job was adding a custom views field into a Drupal 7 site. And I mean, like, I don't even remember at this point how many files that took. It was quite a few. Well, views, because it's in core, now has a plugin system. So writing a custom field, a custom access handler, very simple compared to how it used to be if you understand the plugin system. So I'll tell you right now, if you're not somebody that enjoys reading documentation, if you're not somebody that enjoys looking through example code, this is going to be challenging. I really struggled as somebody coming from a non-computer science background into Drupal 8. Just because object-oriented programming was not something I did a ton in the first half of my career, right? WordPress, Drupal 7 don't really rely on object-oriented programming. So, again, take some time with this. If you haven't done a lot with object-oriented programming, you will not be sad that you're investing time and energy into this today, as it is something that you will need in the future. I do want to just call this out again. I'm not doing you any favors if I, yes, sorry, RTFM is read the manual, and a not very nice word in the middle there. All of your custom code is going to have to change, period. Like, I will state that unequivocally. It may be a small change, or you may like literally be flushing it and completely rewriting it. It's just going to depend on what it is. So again, take some time now to start thinking about how you want to level up your PHP skills, right? Do some reading, do some experimenting with object-oriented PHP development specifically. There are some interesting gotchas with PHP, object-oriented programming versus, say, a C language or Java. That's not to say that if you've done object-oriented languages other than PHP, you're going to have trouble. No, you won't. But if you haven't done object-oriented at all, I would just focus on object-oriented PHP. If you've never used a debugger before, I did not really ever use a debugger until I started doing Drupal 8 stuff. You have to have a debugger for Drupal 8. You just cannot rely on the devel module for like putting DPMs in strategic places. That just does not work very well in Drupal 8 or 9. And again, I'll tell you right now, if you're not using an IDE, if your team is not using IDEs, use IDEs. I happen to use PHP Storm. PHP Storm is not free. Eclipse is free, like VS Code from Microsoft I've heard quite a bit about as well. There are a lot of options out there for you to use, but get ready to use an IDE and make sure you and your team are in agreement. And I have a link somewhere in the slide deck. I've lost track of where, but I'll actually be doing a presentation at GovCon next month on IDE use. So if you haven't used an IDE before, make sure you come to that session, because I will be giving you a crash course in using an IDE with Drupal 8 and 9, debugging, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at a quick example of what code changes between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 and 9 actually look like. So this is about as simple of a form alter as you can make. This is how we used to do it in Drupal 7, right? So we've got our little pass by reference form and our little pass by reference form state. And then we're calling another class to add honeypot to the ticket registration form. This is from ye olden version of the Drupal GovCon website, if you're curious what DGC is. Looking at a different example, and I will be very transparent, this is a different function, right? We're doing something different, but this is still a form alter. And there are two really significant changes between that previous form alter example and this one. The first is that we're specifically typing the form, right? This is a paradigm that you'll see a lot more in Drupal 8 and 9. We're telling PHP that form is just not some rando string coming in, like this should be an array. And we're also telling it that the form state that is coming in should be an instance of the form state interface Drupal class. And in the case of form alter, that's it. That's the only difference. That is not that significant. Now, I'll tell you the guts of that function, like what you're actually doing in your form alter may need to change significantly. But if you're looking at a module that was working functional in Drupal 7 and you want to keep it and make it functional again, this is what a simple update might look like. It's just a matter of tweaking these. And if you happen to be using an IDE, an IDE will actually help you with this, right? You can go autocomplete function capital camp form alter whatever, and it'll actually spit out an example of that hook to show you what is required for that hook. So again, you don't just have to magically know what these are going to require. I'm going to do a couple of times during my presentation here, just link back to some blog articles that I've written. These are all featured on the homepage of mikemadison.net right now, but if you haven't written anything for Drupal 8 or 9 yet, I have a post that literally walks you through the whole process, links to example code, etc. And I actually did a presentation at GovCon on this topic a couple years ago now, and that I think video is linked from the post as well. So if you want to know more about writing modules for Drupal 8 and 9, go check that out. So key takeaways for preparing for the update. Just because Drupal 7 looks like Drupal 8 and 9, and it does, right? If you log into a Drupal 8 site, the actual admin interface doesn't look that different. That's not necessarily a good thing. There's an initiative in the community right now to modernize and update the UI, but like site building is not that different. If you can build a view in Drupal 7, you can build a view in Drupal 8. You may not know what to do with it once you built it, but you can build it. But just because they look the same and they kind of work the same doesn't mean that they're actually the same. And again, the underlying technology and how everything works is vastly different in Drupal 8 and 9. Just be prepared for that. Not everything you used in Drupal 8 and 9, or sorry, not everything you used in Drupal 7 is needed in Drupal 8 and 9. And not everything you used in Drupal 7 is available in Drupal 8 and 9, right? So just again, be prepared that things are changing. And the last thing here is if you are going to move to Drupal 8, it's really critical, and we're going to talk about deprecated code here in a moment, but there's stuff in Drupal 8 that wasn't in Drupal 7 that's already gone for Drupal 9, right? There are APIs and functions and methods that have been updated and rewritten and replaced already. So as you're moving forward, again, read the manual. Make sure that you're looking at the Drupal 9 API, because you could totally migrate yourself from Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 into Drupal 8 in such a way that the next part of this webinar, where we talk about all the stuff you have to do to get ready to move from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9, is going to impact you, right? If you write your functionality with a bunch of deprecated code, you're going to have to go back and rewrite it before you can move to Drupal 9. All right, so if you're on Drupal 7, and everything I just said sounded terrifying, welcome to the future. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on in Drupal 8 and 9. It is a jump. It's a big jump. But hopefully this is the last really significant jump that you're going to have to make. Again, once you're into Drupal 8, this is just an upgrade, a much simpler upgrade. let's talk a little bit about Drupal 8, and then we will take a break at the conclusion of this section. All right, so updating to Drupal 8, from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 should not be a really significant change for you, right? We've been doing this for those of us that have been on Drupal 8 since it released. This is now like the 10th time we've done this, right? From Drupal 8.0 to 8.1, 8.6 to 8.7, 8.7 to 8.8. These are all major version upgrades. So upgrading from Drupal 8.9 to Drupal 9.0 is exactly the same as one of those. There have been some real pain points during those updates. I'm not going to like sugarcoat it. In particular, when the workflow module moved into core, trying to like get out of the workbench world and into the core content moderation world was a real painful experience. But in general, if you've been keeping your site up to date, if you are paying attention to what's going on, if you're making sure that the modules you're using are being updated, if you have a configuration management strategy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, going from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 shouldn't be a huge deal once you've dealt with this, deprecated code. So what does that mean? So here's a screenshot out of some Drupal 8 API code for the Entity Manager interface. And if you look here on line 18, you've got this annotation at deprecated, and it's telling you that as of 8.0.0, so this was actually deprecated like 3 years ago, it's telling you that the Entity Manager has been deprecated, and much of the functionality in this file has been deprecated from Drupal 9, which means if you upgrade to Drupal 9 and you go looking for the Entity Manager, it ain't there, right? Deprecated means it's gone in Drupal 9. And it's going to tell you, instead of using this method, so this particular method is public function get last installed definition, it's telling you, again, read the manual, it's telling you, use Drupal core entity last installed schema repository interface get whatever. It's telling you what to use instead. And you can literally copy this in your IDE, you can right click on this in your IDE and go look at the definition of this method, whatever. It's literally telling you, don't use this instead. Pretty straightforward. And if you're using an IDE and you do something silly, like try to use the Entity Manager, your IDE is actually going to tell you, hey, hello, the Entity Manager is deprecated. You shouldn't be using this. Stop. And again, if you right click on Entity Manager, your IDE will take you directly to what you're trying to use. And then the Drupal core code itself, without ever going to Drupal.org, without ever opening documentation anywhere, just in your IDE, that annotation will tell you, hey, don't use Entity Manager. In this case, use Entity Type Manager instead. So paying attention to deprecated code in your custom code is really critical. Because if you've written code that relies on code that isn't there, your site's going to start PHP fatal erroring, right? Like it's not working, kind of like that's broken, that's down, like people can't use your site. So any custom code that you have for Drupal 8, any part of Drupal 8, Drupal 8.0, 8.9, doesn't matter, you have to be cleared of deprecated code. And you have to have marked that code compatible for Drupal 9. And that's very easy to do. It's just something you put in the .info.yaml file. This also means that all of your contributed code also has to be cleared of all deprecated code and flagged for Drupal 9. And this is less straightforward, right? Because unless you happen to be the module maintainer of that contrib code, you have zero control over number 2, right? This is a binary state. Either something is D9 compatible or it is not. And if it is, cool. And if it is not, crap. If it isn't, your choice is try to contribute something to make it, or abandon that module and look for a different option. Now, thankfully, because of a Herculean effort earlier this year by the Drupal community, the vast majority of the common Drupal modules are D9 compatible, or they have patches that will get them there. But this is a great don't leap before you look sort of situation, because it is not a safe assumption that 100% of the modules are compatible with Drupal 9, because they're not. So fixing what you can control and finding the things that you don't have control of can be automated. And there's actually a couple of great tools out there. Drupal check is a PHP library. This is actually something we include by default in BLT, and it's on by default as a BLT 11. So if you happen to be a user of BLT, cool, thank you. And hopefully, again, I think we added this in BLT 10. So if you're using BLT, you can and should be using Drupal check on your custom code. Sorry, BLT is Acquia's build and launch tools. It's an automation tool and framework to doing development and deployments with Drupal. Good question, thank you. Anyway, Drupal check should be a part of your code quality validation, automated testing, continuous integration, whatever you do, however you do it. Drupal check will tell you whether or not your current code is D9 compatible. You usually can't automate Drupal check until you've gotten to that bar, right? Because if it's going to throw 300 errors about your code not being valid, your builds are all going to start failing. The upgrade status module, which I will show you in a few minutes, is actually even more powerful than Drupal check. Drupal check will just basically tell you yes it is or no it's not, what's wrong, and give you a high level summary. Upgrade status will actually tell you, hey, this is instead, go do this. Like upgrade status is very verbose in its output, but it's also much slower. Like for the demo that I'm going to do here shortly, upgrade status took several hours to run on the Drupal GovCon code base. So that's a little too as part of like a CI process. So use Drupal check in CI, use upgrade status, anywhere, everywhere else, just because they are both super, super awesome. And thank you to those of you that are continuing to hurl URLs into the chat for the group. That is much appreciated. Thank you. So here is a quick example of what deprecated code looks like. And this is actually a screenshot directly off of Drupal.org from the Google Analytics module. So some kind soul ran Drupal check or some other tool on the Google Analytics module some time back. And this is an example of a deprecated code report for a contrib module. If you're using this on your custom code, it's going to tell you the same thing. So in this case, it's telling you in the Google Analytics.module file on line 212, we're making a call to the deprecated method string length of class Drupal component utility Unicode in Drupal 8.6. And this will be removed in Drupal 9, use MB string length instead. Now, in this example, you can almost certainly literally do a copy and paste. You can do a search for string length and replace it with MB string length. Now, that's not always the case. But again, in every one of these cases, it's going to tell you, hey, you're using file unmanaged save data. As of 8.7, this is deprecated. Use the class Drupal core file system interface save data. And what you have to do is basically go in and look at file unmanaged data, compare it to save data in the file system interface and see what's actually required. Is it just a straight up copy and paste? Or do you actually have to write some code? If you're in a class or a plugin, you may have to do some dependency injection. So this is not necessarily a super quick and painless process for your own code. And you can see issues like this in the Drupal issue queue for basically every module. So pick your favorite module, go out to Drupal.org. In many cases, these module issues are already closed and resolved. I had to go into the issue, like the closed issue queue for Google Analytics to find this example. But if you're interested to see what your community has done for you to get these modules ready to go find the D9 deprecation issue that are out there on Drupal.org, and it's really fascinating the amount of work that has gone into this, and we're in a very good place today because of some very heroic efforts by folks in the community. So if you happen to be one of those folks and you're on this call, thank you. Your efforts are really appreciated. If you find stuff that you can't fix, and again, this is stuff that maybe you don't own, like the Google Analytics module, for instance, and that means you are entirely blocked. So again, the update to Drupal 9 is super easy when the board is green. And what I mean by that is all your stuff is marked as D9 compatible. If the board isn't green, you just can't do it, right? You cannot run code on Drupal 9 that relies on deprecated code because that code's gone. So again, your choices are update your contrib to a version. So Devel, for instance, the 2.x version of Devel is not Drupal 9 compatible. The 4.x version of Devel is. That's easy. Upgrade to 4.x. Done. High five. That one's fixed. But if you're talking about some other module that maybe isn't Drupal 9 compatible, your choice is to replace that module with something that is, remove that feature from your site, remove that module from your site, or wait. And I keep saying module, but I want to be really clear. It's any contrib. So themes, profiles, distributions, you name it. If it is PHP code and it is going to run in Drupal 9, it cannot have deprecated code in it, period. So let's take a quick look at two sites. Drupal for Gov, so the parent organization that's hosting this webinar today, is running Drupal 9. I've linked out to the pull request that I did for this. I also did a pretty in-depth blog article on this process. There are some minor configuration changes here, although in fairness, most of these configuration changes were from Lightning being updated to Lightning 5. There are actually 0 configuration changes from Drupal core itself, moving from 8.9 to 9.0. If you're unfamiliar with the Drupal configuration system, we'll talk a little bit about it after the break. But it's essentially what features is in Drupal 7, right? It's how you manage your site building in Drupal 8. But basically, in this case, right, like Drupal core, we were running 8.9.0. We upgraded to core 9.0 with Composer update. We had to update a couple of other modules, again, Devel and reCAPTCHA. The 2.2 and 2.1 version, respectively, of those modules were not compatible. I know they were not compatible, by the way. One moment. So if we look at reCAPTCHA here, it would help if I spelled it correctly. Here you can see the 2.x version requires Drupal 8. The 3.0 version requires Drupal 8 or 9. So real quick when you look at a module if it's Drupal 9 compatible. If this isn't here, it's probably not. You can always dig into the issues and hope to find a patch, but that's your litmus test, right? So to do this, we literally had to update 2 modules. Lightning has really publicly talked about this, right? The 4.x version of Lightning is not compatible with Drupal 9. The 5.x version is. Same with BLT. BLT, the 11x version is for Drupal 8. The 12.x version is for Drupal 9. So again, there were a few underlying dependencies that just had to get updated here. And then the update went very, very smoothly. And if you want to see sort of what that process looked like I said, the blog article is linked both from this pull request off of the Drupal for Gov pull request, and then it'll also be in the slides when we share those out. DrupalGovCon.org, which is the site for the Drupal GovCon conference, is not running Drupal 9 yet. Main reason for that is we have a conference coming up in a few weeks, and I'm not going to do a major Drupal upgrade, no matter how confident I am in it, right before the conference. We'll do it right after the conference. But I wanted to show you what this looks like. I'm running locally in Lando. I just wanted to show you sort of what upgrade status looks like. So this is the normal update page from Update Manager in Drupal core. You can see here, we're more or less running the most current version of most modules. There's a few things that we haven't updated, but this board is mostly green from a what are we running right now versus what's available out there perspective. And that means nothing, because when you come in and look at upgrade status is actually going to tell us that we have 163 errors across 17 of those projects, with another 300 some odd warnings across 53 projects. So even though my normal update tells me you're good, upgrade status is telling me, whoa, 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 not so fast, you're not good. So remember, a few minutes ago, I told you that the libraries API is not Drupal 9 compatible. Well, I'm running Drupal 8.x 1.1. Upgrade status is telling me that with that current version of code, I have one deprecation warning. And you can see here, called a deprecated function. Excuse me. Called a deprecated function system get info is deprecated, just like we saw before. And then some other things that you need to check manually. And then it's telling me that the 8.2.0 beta 3 version of component libraries is compatible with Drupal 9. So if I want to continue my upgrade process on Drupal GovCon, I will either have to upgrade libraries to the 2.0 beta 3 version, or I will have to remove it. Similarly, config ignore is throwing some errors here, right? So again, this is something that before you can do your upgrade, you have to do these updates. And some of them, like Devel, no big deal. We know that the 4.0 version is compatible. I could go ahead and update Devel now to 4.x, and 59 of my errors would go away. But if you're running Drupal 8, running upgrade status is pretty lightweight. It takes some time, but other than that, it's no big deal. And that'll tell you really quickly how close you are to having a green board that'll let you actually do that update. And shout outs to Gabor and Matt and all of the folks that are managing upgrade status in Drupal check, because this process of determining these things is significantly easier because of those tools. So key takeaways: as long as the board is green, again, upgrade status is green, Drupal check comes back with nothing, it should be a pretty painless update. Obviously proactively avoid modules starting right now, even if you're potentially going to wait until the last possible second to do your upgrades. Start making architectural decisions today that will make your upgrade easier, right? So avoid modules that have no D9 compatibility. Now, the XML sitemap module today is D9 compatible, but we started to build in May, and at that time, XML sitemap was not compatible with Drupal 9. So we made the decision on that project to use simple sitemap instead of XML sitemap, because again, at that time, simple sitemap was already ready to go for Drupal 9, and XML sitemap was not. So make those sorts of decisions if you can today. And then the last thing I just want to call out is, even though upgrade status and Drupal check are amazing tools, they're still fallible, right? And I have found modules that are marked as Drupal 9 ready or Drupal 9 compatible that fatal error sites because they're not actually there. So you still want to do other testing. You still want to do your own functional testing, regression testing, et cetera. Because again, even though these two tools are amazing, they can still miss things. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pause, because we're about an hour in, about halfway through. We're going to take a 5-minute bio break, refill your water, hit the restroom. If you have questions about either the Drupal 7 or the Drupal 8 material that I just covered, go ahead and throw them in chat. I will spend some time here in the next 5 to 10 minutes answering those questions. And then we're going to move on. And in the second half of our webinar, we're going to talk about best practices and starting to do some automated testing. So with that, we will start doing the Q&A here in just a couple of minutes. And we will most likely start forward again on slides around between 3:10 and 3:15. So we'll be back momentarily. All right, folks, I know some of you may still be out, but we are recording this. So if you come back and I'm mid-sentence, you can always check the recording. So some questions from chat. Abby says, I was going to ask about BLT. I think we were looking into starting our site on D9 instead of D8, but BLT wasn't ready yet. Is it ready now or will it be soon? It is ready. BLT 12 is compatible with Drupal 9, and I am using it on sites like Drupal for Gov. Do definitely read the release notes for BLT 12. The team has done some significant re-architecting, and some of the plugins that we have all come to love and expect to be there, like PHP, CodeSniffer, Behat, Drupal VM, are now split out into separate packages. So they're still there, they're still maintained, they still work, but they don't come with BLT 12 out of the box. And if you actually look at my pull request for Drupal for Gov, you'll actually see that here, where when I upgraded to BLT 12, I also had to add the Behat and the PHP CodeSniffer plugins, so those features continue to work. But yes, BLT 12 is absolutely out and ready to use with Drupal 9. Rajiv asks, do you have any guidance for upgrading from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9? I mean, honestly, that first section of the preparing for the update, the from Drupal 7, everything I told you there is applicable for both Drupal 8 and Drupal 9. And I would strongly recommend that you jump directly to Drupal 9. At this point, Drupal 8 is really only getting minor updates. And if you upgrade into Drupal 8, you're still going to have to update to Drupal 9 at some point anyway. So the only real reason I would say to avoid Drupal 9 is if there happens to be some contrib module that you just absolutely cannot live without that isn't ready for Drupal 9 yet, that might be a legit reason to skip, not to skip Drupal 8 and go to Drupal 8 for a bit. But you actually have more runway with Drupal 7 right now than you have with Drupal 8, right? Because Symfony 3 is going end of life next year, period. So Drupal 8 will have to go end of life next year, and again, they've extended Drupal 7. So again, my recommendation today, August 20th, 2020, is to go directly from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9. Thank you for those two questions. Is there anybody else who has a question about the D7, D8 portion of the webinar while we're here? And of course, you're welcome to ask them at the end as well, but I find doing QA a little closer to some of the material sometimes keeps it fresh and make sure we don't miss a question. I'm curious, just for those of you that are back from the break, how many of you are on D7 versus how many of you are on D8? Or are most of the folks, we got about 60 some here right now, are most people on 7 or 8? 7, some of each. Congrats on your upgrade this week, Jess. Sounds like you're getting ready to do it again. Well timed. Some folks doing both. A lot of D7s, and that was sort of my expectation. Oh, Open Atrium for D7. I've lost track of if Open Atrium is being maintained in D8 and D9. That's definitely something I would recommend doing a little bit of research into. If you're using a distro, a lot of the modules that the distro supports are almost certainly still around, but I know some distros are not as actively maintained in D8. Yeah, that's what I wondered. And that's okay, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. But it does mean it may make your migration a little bit more active. I'm really excited, folks, to see how many of you are saying that you're either just doing a migration into D8 or you're in the process of doing them right now. That's really awesome, and I'm glad some of you are being proactive in doing this now. It is, especially coming from D7, it is a big jump. So doing that now while you still have some runway, you still have some time, is well worth the effort. Question in chat from Chris: does anybody know how close the context module is for D9. Chris, I do not, but if any kind soul on the webinar happens to know, sounds like Chris could use some help there. So even though D7 core will be supported, what is the guess as to how many modules will be supported? That is a great question mark. With community support ending, I think it's probably safe to assume that most D7 modules will stop getting updates. And in fact, I would not be surprised, I don't have any empirical evidence to back this up today, but I would be willing to wager some quantity of money or beer that many module maintainers have already slowed their contributions to their Drupal 7 modules. So just food for thought there. I think that will continue to happen, continue to slow as we get closer and closer to the D7 end of life. And I really doubt that the companies that are going to be doing that maintenance will extensively maintain Contrib. So I would prepare for the worst there, if possible. Give me just a moment. I need to switch headphones because apparently my AirPods are dying. Good timing as always. And then we'll pick this back up for part 2. One moment.
Okay, can you all still hear me okay? Awesome. Let's move on to adopting best practices. So in this section, I will warn you now, we've got about 45 minutes left in the webinar, and we are covering these 4 topics and automated testing in 45 minutes. So we're not going to go super deep into any of these topics. We're going to touch on them at a high level. I do have some blog articles on some of these, and I do link out to some documentation on some of these. So this is not intended to be an in-depth tutorial on how to fix your code quality. It's to introduce you to the topic and to get you started. So we're going to move pretty quick. So let's talk about development workflow. We've already talked a little bit about how different development is in Drupal 8 and 9 versus in Drupal 7 and below. A lot of that comes down to the object-oriented programming that you're doing, the dependency management that you will hopefully be using, the configuration management workflow that you will hopefully be implementing. So all of those things really benefit from having a standardized workflow. Also, if you happen to be in an organization where your development team is not the team that's doing deployments and security updates and things like that, having a standardized workflow amongst your organization really helps cut down on the variation between we are now going to build something versus now we are going to deploy or update something. Standardized workflow is much easier to support. It can be reused across your organization. I saw many folks in the chat saying that you actually are doing multiple sites or you have multiple projects in various stages of Drupal versions. So again, standardizing your workflow actually cuts down on the cost of maintaining many sites. Using common technologies, common IDEs, common virtual machines, makes it a lot easier for folks to onboard onto your team, switch between projects, etc. And in no small part, it's also good for team morale, right? Because if you've got one developer who's out on an island dealing with something silly that nobody else is experiencing, the experience for that person is going to be really terrible. On the other hand, if I'm having a problem and you all are using Lando and you're all using PHP Storm and I'm overlooking something, or maybe you've already fixed my problem, we can work together to solve those problems because we have a standardized workflow and tool set. If you've seen me talk before, we commonly share this slide. This is a super basic workflow. Feel free to swap out your preferred technologies. But we typically assume that you're going to be doing local development in some sort of web server virtual environment. Again, Lando, Drupal VM, DDev, Doxel, pick your poison, Dev Desktop. You're going to do all of your development there. You're going to push that development, whether that's configuration, custom PHP, whatever, out into a version control system like GitHub, GitLab, your own private Git. You're going to run some sort of continuous integration, whether that's, again, Acquia's pipelines, Travis CI, Circle CI, anybody else's CI or pipelines tools. And then you'll ultimately deploy that into your hosting environment, again, whether that's an Acquia product or whoever's product to host. In D8, D9, an example workflow might look something like this, right? So you do some development. Maybe I'm going to build a blog. To build the blog, it's very similar to Drupal 7, right? I'm going to go in, I'm going to create a new content type. I'm going to assign some fields to that content type. I'm going to build a view. I'm going to assign some permissions to some roles. And then I'm going to export configuration. And for this sort of development, that's going to be dozens of configuration files. I can submit a pull request out to GitHub and watch my CI process run. CI in this case would most likely spin up a new version of Drupal, import the configuration, hopefully run some automated tests against that site. Somebody will hopefully do manual code review against that. Merge the pull request, continuous integration should then run again on your integration branch. And then it would ultimately get deployed out to a hosting environment. Again, hopefully a lower, like a development or a testing environment for further review and testing prior to that code going live. Without a standardized workflow, there are some bad things that can happen. If you have 6 people on your team and everybody does it differently, you kind of run into this wild, wild west of code quality, submission, process. You can frequently lose the benefits of using a tool like Git or continuous integration, right? If you've got one person who's just constantly merging crap into your upstream and pushing it, and everybody else is doing pull requests, like what's the point of doing pull requests? If you have somebody who's deploying directly to your web server and bypassing continuous integration because it takes too long, like again, what's the point of having that tool, that, like, why take a parachute with you if you're not going to put it on before you jump out of the plane, right? If your DevOps team is doing something very differently from your development team, you could have very different results. And I've seen this time and time again where things work in development and then you go deploy it and it doesn't work. And you're like, well, what did you do differently during the deployment process? Oh, we skipped these couple of things. Well, don't do that, right? We want the developers and the people doing deployments in DevOps doing the same stuff in the same order, the same way. That way, if it works for the developers, it should also work for DevOps. And again, you don't ever want to be in this situation where you don't know what works and you don't know what's broken, right? Standardizing your workflow and providing automated testing, automated code quality, installation and bootstrapping of Drupal, all of these things are best practices that help keep you out of trouble. So what I recommend that you do to help define your workflow, the one I gave you is a sample. It's what we at Acquia recommend, but that's okay. You don't have to use that one exactly. What I recommend that you do is look at your team, and you can be a team of 1 and still do this. That's okay. Because someday maybe you'll be a team of 2 and you need to share this information with your new partner in crime. Examine the various stages that you're undertaking during development, right? You're writing code, you're doing site building. We use Git, but we use Git on a self-hosted Git, whatever. Figure out all of the stuff you do to get from I'm starting this new thing to it's going to be out on my production website. And write all that down, right? Document it. And then automate it. Anything you can do to automate that process cuts down on the chance that your new partner in crime is going to do it different. And it also cuts down on the chance that, oh, shoot, we forgot to do testing this time, darn, right? If you have automated testing and your CI runs that testing, you should not be merging code until CI has run the automated tests and they pass, period. If you're doing manual testing and oh, yep, I did it. I tested it. It's done. Okay. Yep. Next. It's done. Yeah, right. The results may vary. So key takeaways of defining and standardizing a workflow. Everybody has a different workflow. That's okay. At the end of the day, what's important is that you have analyzed how you want your team to do the work. You've documented it and you've all agreed on what you're deviating from and why you're deviating. you've all agreed on what you're doing. And on the next one, know where you are deviating from best practices. So if there is something that Acquia or the community or whoever PHP community recommends, do it this way, and you're instead doing it that way, again, that's probably okay. But align if you can and explain why you're doing it differently if not, right? If you hire somebody from the community who's used to doing it the community way and you're doing it very differently, like, why is that? And again, automate everything you possibly can. Or possible can, if you can't spell like me. Code quality. Code quality is actually an important part of a standardized development workflow. And what I mean by code quality is a few things, right? That means that code is written thoughtfully, not just peanut buttered out there, to conform to industry or community best practices. Code is written both in a secure and performant way. There are some very obviously safe and very obviously unsafe ways to write Drupal code. If you don't know the difference, you should know the difference before you start doing custom PHP. Similar with performance, right? There are some really stupid things you can do while you're writing code. I'm not saying you're stupid, but you can do some really stupid things when you're writing custom PHP code that will absolutely destroy the performance of a website. Disabling cache tags, for instance. Cache tags weren't a thing in Drupal 7. If you turn them off in Drupal 8 in your code, yeah, performance is going to be really bad. And again, your code is written to align as a team to a common architecture. My definition of architecture may be different from yours. That's probably okay, as long as your team agrees on how you're going to do it, right? At the end of the day, I'm not here to tell you what you and your team have to do. I'm here making recommendations to make things better. And as long as you have a process and you agree on that process and it works for you, that's the important part. Why should you care? Or maybe if you care, why should your bosses care is a better question. If you have code and historical reference in your Git repository for your code that can be easily read and contributed to, that means it's easier and cheaper and faster to onboard more people onto your team. And those people onboarding are going to have a better experience than they might otherwise. If you have code that is of high quality, it's more easily managed and more easily maintained than code. And particularly on this topic, if you're all writing to the same code standards, one of the first things that happens on a project when you're not all using the same coding standards is everybody's editors does this all over the place. And you look at the Git diff and every line in the file changes because your editor just adjusted spacing by 1 character or 2 characters. Like, that's no, like, don't do that. Make sure you're all doing the same thing and you're all following the same standards. And then the last thing is that you want your code to be easily updated and maintained and easily tested. So if you are making changes, I talked about this on my blog recently, right? There's this concept in being an outdoors person, a hiker, a backpacker, a camper, to leave no trace, right? If you're out in the wilderness, you should not leave a bunch of garbage in the wilderness. If you take it out there with you, take it back out with you. And when you're doing coding and following coding standards and best practices, you want to follow those same principles. Have the most minimal amount of impact possible on the code that you're changing so that the changes that you're making can be reliably tested. It can be easily tracked, so on and so forth. If you go in and do just a ton of stuff all over the place, again, what's the point of having that code history? Overall, the improvement of code quality is going to lower the cost of ownership of the code. That means it's going to take your team less time to manage it and maintain it. That means it's going to be easier to onboard people. And again, it does significantly reduce the chances of things going horribly wrong. And I didn't put this one on the page, but if something does go horribly wrong, having really clean code and really pristine code history helps you debug and troubleshoot when something does go wrong. So let's talk about how to get started. Again, as I said at the top of the webinar, start using an IDE. IDEs are much better suited for custom development in Drupal 8 and Drupal 9. I can't tell you how many times I've done an interview with a potential developer that's a consultant or a hire, And I start just looking through this code. And I think the record I found was over 1,500 code quality issues in like 250 lines of code. And a significant portion of those would have been caught if the code would have been written in an IDE. Because a lot of what was there was bad spacing, unused variables, unused use statements, just a lot of stuff that the IDE is going to do automatically just out of the box. And even more, if you're using a dot editor config file, you can even more do work to standardize line spacing, line endings, tab characters. Here's the link to that session I mentioned earlier, where I'm going to be talking about setting up and using an IDE for development. Adopt tools for code standards and code quality. There's a lot of them out there. I've had good experience with PHP Code Sniffer, PHP-CS, and Grum PHP. These are both tools that can consume the Drupal Coder project that is on Drupal.org as a project, but it's not really a module. It's just a package that PHP Code Sniffer can consume to basically test all of the Drupal standards. Validate your composer. If you're writing Sass, JS, CSS, whatever, make sure that you're doing linting for those, Twig, YAML as well. I mean, basically, you know, the general rule should be if you're writing code in some language, like I don't care what language, some language, you should be scanning that language in the custom code that you're writing for code quality, assuming it conforms to some standard, right? Even Twig has a standard that you should be following, and there are tools out there that will scan that Twig syntax for you to make sure you're doing it right. You should also then automate these tools, right? If you're going to take the time to set up PHP Code Sniffer with the Drupal Coder project and get it all working, you should automate that. So with a BLT project, BLT actually provides Git hooks. So anytime I try to commit code locally, BLT will automatically run PHP Code Sniffer on the files I'm trying to commit. So if I have code that I've written, and yes, even I write code in the first draft that is not conformant to standards, the Git hook will catch it. So I can't even commit the bad code until I go fix it. Is that annoying? Yes. Is it less annoying than accidentally deploying broken code to prod? No. Shell scripts or other automation. So I can run BLT validate locally and it'll automatically do all that validation. And you should have that validation running in CI. As an architect, I will not review your code until it passes a continuous integration run that tests for code quality, because I don't care if it works. If the code quality is bad, we're not going to merge it anyway. Despite having these automated steps, you also still want to have a manual code review process. Just like with Drupal check and upgrade status, these tools are great. The rules are great. They're very, very, very well defined, but they still miss things, right? It could very well be that code is in the wrong place. A very common example of that is a pre-process function. You can put a pre-process function in a theme. You can put a pre-process function in a module. And if you've got different developers putting things in different places, that can get real messy real quick. So again, manual code reviews are a really good catch to make sure that even though we are of quality, we're architecturally doing this in a way that makes sense. So key takeaways on code quality. If you're using some language on your project, you should be adhering to best practices of code quality for that language. And what I mean by that is PHP in general has different rules of code quality than React does. So if you have React developers on your project, you want to make sure that you are scanning the React code with a JS linter that is following good rules for JavaScript and React development. And if you're doing PHP, you should be scanning the PHP files with something like PHP Code Sniffer. Don't hold your React developers to the same standards that you're holding your PHP developers, because they're different languages and they have different rules. Automate the scanning of that code quality as much as possible with community tools and products. And again, remember, manual code review is still quite important. All right, next we're going to talk about dependency management. I will tell you right now that the single most challenging thing for me personally moving from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 was Composer. And the reason for that is I had never used a dependency manager before. It was a completely alien concept to me. Like, I understood the general idea, but I was really confused. And again, I talked about this on my blog recently. I was really confused about why it was that I had downloaded a module and that module didn't come with all the stuff I needed to use it. In this case, it happened to be the Search API Solr module. And like, my site was throwing fatal errors because the Solarium library was missing. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? Well, Composer is there to make sure you never get into that pickle, right? Because there is interdependence between software, between modules, between libraries, between modules and libraries. And that Search API example is a great one. Solr requires certain things to run. So if you're going to install the Search API Solr module, you have to have all of those interdependencies in place. This is a big shift from Drupal 7, where you very commonly would just download a Drupal 7 archive and all the little JavaScript libraries and crap that you need to run it are just bundled up in that tar file. That's really not the case in D8. So be prepared. Now that I've used it for 4 years, now that I've used it every day, Composer is something that is no sweat, right? And I got there much faster than 4 years. So don't feel like you're 4 years away from this. But getting used to using Composer is something that I think will take you a little bit if you, like me, don't come from a software engineering computer science background. Dependencies include a couple of things, like the name of the package, the version of the package, and versions matter. Like, versions matter a lot, as we've already talked about earlier in the webinar. Devel 2 does not work with Drupal 9. Devel 4 does. Got to know that. What type of package is it? Is it a module, a profile, a theme, a library, etc.? Again, this matters because Composer's smart enough to know, hey, this is a Drupal module. Because it's a Drupal module, I need to put this in a specific place so Drupal will see it and use it. Versus, is this just a generic library like Drupal VM that isn't actually something Drupal needs? Drupal VM is a tool you use to develop Drupal. It's not actually a Drupal module that runs in Drupal. So again, type of package is very important because it directly impacts the location of that package. So let's take a quick example of a Drupal module, right? And we already talked about this a little bit. Obviously a Drupal module doesn't work without Drupal, right? It's not like you can take the Google Analytics Drupal module and go install it on a web server and just use it. It's not a microservice, it is a Drupal module. So there is a hard dependency in the Google Analytics module on Drupal, and in some cases, a specific version of Drupal. And if you look in the module, we have special denotations for Drupal modules for that. But there are some other dependencies here, right? So in this case, the Lightning Workflow module has a hard dependency on the Drupal core content moderation module. And it also has a hard dependency on the Lightning Core module. Now, there's a problem with this. There's a good thing and a bad thing, right? The good thing is that you can't turn on Lightning Workflow without content moderation and Lightning Core being turned on. So good, that's good. But the bad thing is that .info file, this info.yaml file, just flags this as a dependency. It doesn't actually do anything to require these dependencies in the Composer sense. There's a different file for that. And that's where Composer comes in. So basically what Composer does, there are two files, a composer.json file, composer.lock file. And in your composer.json file, this is where you broadly define things. Like, I want Drupal's Devel module somewhere in the 4.x range. Composer will then go out to a service like Packagist and see, do I know what Drupal Devel is? And if it does, Packagist will know that on Drupal.org, there is a repository for the Devel module. And it will figure out what version of Devel to download. And I mean very specifically. It'll actually pull down, like if 4.1 is the current, Composer will go get 4.1, and then it will lock our Composer at 4.1. So if all of us are contributing to a project together and I add Devel at version 4.1, and then 4.2 comes out tomorrow, the only way any of us get version 4.2 is if somebody goes through and updates the Composer to run version 4.2. And then we can all update to 4.2. Composer specifically locks us in at specific dependencies, versions, to make sure that we're all running the same version, we all have the same intertwining dependencies, and everything's stable and it works. So just as a quick example here, let's go look at the composer.json file for the Lightning project, for Lightning workflow. You can see that there are a number of requirements here. This is a non-Drupal package. This is for installing patches, and then it requires a handful of Drupal modules: autosave form, conflict core, Drupal core itself, the diff module, lightning core, moderation dashboard, moderation sidebar. So it basically is telling you right up front that if you do a composer require Drupal Lightning workflow, Composer's automatically going to go get these things and add them to your project for you. This is why frequently, like on Drupal GovCon, for instance, we do not explicitly require the diff module. If you go look at the composer.json file for Drupal GovCon, diff is not in there. But Lightning is, and because Lightning requires diff, we get diff because of this line of code literally right here. You can also then scroll down if you want in the file and see, there's patches. So Lightning is adding a patch to the autosave form module. Looks like that's for testing Drupal 9 and some other stuff that we're not going to get into today. One thing I do want to note about Lightning, Lightning is a module. Lightning workflow is a module. It is not a project. There are some like a module versus like an actual build for a website project or a platform project. There are some really specific differences between building a module that you're going to go put out on Drupal.org and building a package or a project or something that you're building out for a website. The biggest difference is for a module, for a theme, for whatever, you do need a composer.json file, but you probably would not commit the lock file. For a build, like the GovCon build, the Drupal for Gov build, whatever, we do merge in the lock file. Because with a module, you want it to be general enough that people can use it. For a site, you want it to be really hyper-specific so nothing breaks. Anyway, there's another example here, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving along. You're welcome to go have a look at the BLT or any other Drupal GovCon, Drupal for Gov, whatever, composer.lock and JSON files in your free time. So again, Composer lets you define what you're wanting, and it just sort of manages it. The old way of doing things, the way I did them for a long time, was all the things go and get, right? So you download the archive, you unzip the archive, and then you commit tens of thousands of files into your Git repository. With Composer, you're going to commit the composer.lock and the composer.json and your custom code, and that's it. Right? So your actual repository, if you go look at our GovCon repository, yes, I have a docroot directory. Yes, I have a modules directory. No, I do not have a contrib directory, because none of the contrib modules that we use on Drupal for Gov or GovCon are actually committed into the repo, because Composer handles the installation of all the stuff we need for this project during our CI/CD process for us. Really cuts down on the footprint, really cuts down on the amount of stuff that you have to manage in your repo. And honestly, committing all those files really defeats the purpose of using Composer, right? Composer is there to manage those dependencies. It also, again, just really helps to make sure that everything is tracked and managed all the way down recursively. I will call out that it is a real challenge to half-ass Composer. Like, if you're going to do it, do it. Don't dip a toe in. Like, if you're going to do dependency management, you need to do dependency management. And if you're going to be running Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, you really should be using Composer. You can run into some circumstances with what I would call dependency recursion, where you're trying to do something, but that thing conflicts with something else, which maybe also conflicts with something else. Again, this is one of the reasons that adopting Composer can be a challenge if you don't work with it frequently, if you don't know how to get yourself out of trouble, you can get into trouble and stay in trouble. So, you know, my best advice is take some time with Composer, try to break things, and try to figure out how to unbreak things. Composer is actually really good about telling you what's wrong. You just have to be willing to read the output and potentially Google some stuff. So again, this comes back to read the manual, right? Last thing I want to just call out is that your hosting requirements are very different than development requirements. So if you look at a hosting file system for Drupal for Gov versus our development repository in GitHub, the files are totally different, right? Because if I'm using Google Analytics on Drupal for Gov, the Google Analytics module actually has to be there for the website. It doesn't have to be there in the development repository, but it does locally for me to run the website. It does in production for me to run the website. And you're not going to run like Composer install every time somebody visits your site. So again, you need to have some sort of process during your deployment that installs and manages your dependencies for you. That way, as you deploy your hosting artifact, you are sort of installing all of those dependencies to make sure that everything that Composer manages is in place and ready to go for use on the actual site after the deployment concludes. BLT does that for you out of the box. There are other tools that do that for you out of the box. Drupal does not do that for you out of the box because that, again, that's a Composer thing, not a Drupal thing. Here's a list of common commands. I'm not going to go through these in depth right now, but you know, basically you can add dependencies, update dependencies. Composer even gives you some really useful debugging, like why is this here? Why can't I add this? Really good stuff and very well documented out there in the community. And we already talked a little bit about CI, right? You want to automate your dependency management as much as possible using a CI tool. Last thing I just want to call out here that a requirement is not the same thing as a dependency, right? So if you go look at Drupal.org, Drupal.org tells you that Drupal has like 3 requirements, right? MySQL, Apache, and PHP, and that's it. Well, I mean, that's true from a requirements perspective, but if you look at the actual dependencies of the GovCon project, there's a lot of stuff here, right? And obviously some of these are self-imposed dependencies because we've added modules and those modules have added modules or packages. But, you know, this is 3 columns of terminal output and it didn't all fit. So just be aware that, and I stole this image from Matthew Grasmick and Jeff Geerling from their Composer talk in Nashville a couple years ago, but untangling the web that Composer spins can be very painful. And that's one of the beauties of it. You don't really have to, as long as you understand what it's doing. So yeah, automate Composer and save yourself a lot of trouble. Key takeaways here: stop downloading archive files off of Drupal.org. Go all the way with Composer. Don't just, you know, kind of halvesy, like do it, and automate that dependency management as much as possible to save yourself a headache. Moving on, configuration management. I just want to do a quick time check here. I think we can make it. Configuration, and I did a talk at Drupal GovCon a couple years ago and a webinar recently, like last year on this topic. So I go into significantly more depth on configuration management in that webinar. So we're just going to brush the surface here. But basically configuration is all the stuff that you set up doing site building, right? The state of certain actions, like you know, how a form has been filled out, defining stuff like content types or views or blocks or roles or whatever. That's all stored in config. Some quick differentiators: if you create a new menu, like configuration menus, you add a menu, or structure menus, add a menu, that creates a new config for the menu. If you go into that menu and then you add a homepage link, the link is content. If you create a new role, that role is config. If you assign a permission to that role, that's config. If you assign a user that role, that's content. They both live in the database, but they're very different creatures, and this is quite important. Drupal also has the the notion of both more complex or entity config. These are things like content types and fields and so on and so forth. And there's also simpler config. So as you start wading into config, again, we're not going to get super deep into this today. Just be aware that there's an awful lot in the configuration management system about how it's stored on disk versus in the database, et cetera, et cetera. One of the big problems that people face as they move from sort of that features-based or no configuration workflow in D7 into Drupal 8 is how do you manage a configuration workflow? And basically what that means is that example I gave you earlier. I want to build a blog locally. I don't want to have to go out to my production website and manually click and create the content types and rebuild all the fields. So we need a way of taking that site building that I'm doing locally and pushing it up the stack to the production website. And again, that's where a configuration workflow comes into place. Typically, this is going to use Drush. It's going to be something that you're importing those YAML files off of your project code base into the database as part of your deployment. So, again, here's that example workflow that I talked about earlier. Create a blog, build a view, export some YAML files. That gives your architect or your lead developer, whoever, a chance to review what you've done. If I'm reviewing your work, I should be able to take your config files from the pull request and install them on my local site and see the exact same blog and view and all that stuff that you had. If not, we got a problem. And then same with the deployment, right? Once I've deployed, I should see the exact same blog, the exact same view, all the stuff that you did locally should end up in the cloud or in production after those deployments. You also want to make sure that you have a configuration management strategy. Drupal core gives you the configuration management system, but it doesn't do a lot to sort of robustly manage config. So a super common example is that the database dblog, database logging module, is not very performant. It's really useful locally for troubleshooting, but typically it's better to use syslog in production. There's not a great way using the core configuration management system to say, if I'm locally, use dblog. If I'm in production, use syslog. But if you have a configuration management strategy that takes those things into consideration, maybe the config split module is going to be your best bet. So you can do that conditional config locally versus in the cloud. I'm going to keep moving. Again, there's some information here. You're welcome to come back to the recording freeze frame. I also have like a 4 or 5 part series on my blog about configuration management. All this information and more is there. Key takeaways on config. It is a new concept in D8. Even if you've worked with features in the past, it is a little different in D8 and D9. So just be aware of that. And again, as you're thinking about your development workflow, make sure you have a configuration management workflow and a configuration management strategy of how you want to actually manage your config, deploy your config, and share your config amongst your team. And for those of you that are working on multiple sites, multiple projects, the more you can do to align your workflow and your strategy and the tools you use to implement those things across your team, across those projects, the better off you're going to be. All right, got a few minutes left to talk about testing. I'm going to talk about 2 areas of focus in this section. We're going to cover functional and visual regression testing. Functional testing is probably going to use one of these frameworks, although could be others. Behat with the Drupal extension is great for functional testing. You can do stuff with PHP Unit. I would say Pro PHP Unit ships with Drupal core, but Con PHP Unit is a little harder to write because it requires object-oriented PHP experience. Even though it is a unit testing framework, you can also use it for functional testing. You don't have to just write unit tests with PHP Unit. I'm actually using it on a project right now to do functional testing just like Behat, and it's working great. Nightwatch is the JavaScript framework that ships with Drupal core. And you could also look at implementing something like Pally for accessibility testing. And I'm actually talking about automating accessibility testing with Pally at Drupal GovCon. the big reason I'm calling these things out is that as you're future-proofing, right, everything we're talking about here today is about future-proofing. And there's no better way to make sure that what you've got today that works is still going to work tomorrow after you do your upgrade than by having a robust suite of automated tests, right? The more you have your testing locked down, the better the chance that when you go, oops, I broke something, you're not going, oops, I broke something in production. You're going, oops, I broke something in your CI. Fail early, fail often is a much better model than fail late and fail expensively. So how to get started with functional testing. Kind of like your configuration management, right? Put together an automated testing strategy. Spending time up front developing good automated testing pays off in spades later, particularly as we think about doing these major updates, right? Anything you build out now is going to be around for literally years to come. So it is something that is going to pay off massively. And again, breaking something in a lower environment is great. That means you didn't break prod. If you don't have automated tests today, obviously writing a whole bunch of automated tests for a legacy project can be a daunting project. My recommendation would be focus on anything that would get you sued or impact your finances. I don't even know what word that is. So anything you can do there to improve your standing would be good, right? Because if you get sued because of a feature going down, or maybe you're exposing data, data breach, something like that, that'd be really bad. Next, once we get away from the financial and legal ramifications, focus on anything that might be really embarrassing to your organization. Maybe you wouldn't get sued, but it would look bad for the government if something happened. Is there anything that would significantly impact the end user experience or just generally impact your platform negatively? So if you approach your testing in this order of priority, hopefully you can make it a more manageable process to integrate functional testing as you go. And remember, if you're building a brand new site that is basically the same features, you could actually start writing BHAT tests today for a Drupal 7 platform, and then use those same tests on a Drupal 8 or Drupal 9 platform, or a Drupal 8 platform to Drupal 9. If you're building a completely new site with totally different features, totally different design, totally different content, you probably can't use the same BHAT tests. I also want to call out here that if you're building a new platform, it is significantly faster, cheaper, and easier to build tests as you build features than it might be to get all the way through your build process, then go back and write tests, right? Build your tests as you build your platform. Last section, couple minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. Visual regression testing is something that lets you compare visually the current state of your site with a future state. So for example, nifty file that I downloaded off the Backstop GitHub, in this example, you can see here, their lemur, I think, is mooning us. In this picture, the lemur is facing us. So the diff between those is highlighted in pink, right? You can see the tip of the tail there, and then the shape of the lemur's head. So again, if during your update, you're going to have a site that looks one way and will theoretically look the same way on the other side, visual regression testing can be really good to catch that during the update process. Having said that, visual regression testing is a real pain in the butt to implement while you're doing development, because literally every time you do anything that's going to change, you're going to trip a failure. So this is something I typically recommend implementing much later in the project, once you've done most of your theming, once you've got some really good example content. But again, a really great safety net to put in place before you get ready to do a really major upgrade. And again, with visual regression, a lot of it is, assuming that you're going to be keeping the same design, and you should be automating this as well. And again, investing in testing now really does pay off in the future. So with that, we're going to wrap up and do some Q&A. If you have any further questions or comments, my email's here. You're welcome to reach out. Also, again, I'm on the internet most places at Mike Madison. So hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn, visit my blog, let me know what questions you have either now or later. If you do have some questions now, I think we've got a few minutes left. Go ahead and throw them in chat. All right, first question from Jess. If you're on Drupal 8, looking to move to Drupal 9 and want to use the spec tool, I would probably use the version 4 for the spec tool. And honestly, the Google Sheet version of it, I don't think is that different. There may be a few like tactical changes in the 4.x version to align better with Lightning 5. But I think it's more if you want to add it as a requirement on your project that there are some underlying dependency differences. But yeah, if you're going to be building, if you're collecting requirements for Drupal 9, I would use version 4.x of the spec tool just to do the D9 version of what you're going to be building. No problem. Any other questions? We've got 50 people hanging out. There's got to be one. Question from B. If web server doesn't have outbound internet after running Composer, what files and folders should be checked in or deployed? Is it safe to use Composer to get files without knowing what it is? So yeah, that's a great question. So typically what I recommend, and in fact, this is how we do it with BLT on Acquia hosting. We do the Composer generation in our CI tool, not on the actual production or development or any of the servers. So as we're doing that second CI run, right? So pull request gets open, CI runs on the pull request. Merge the pull request, and the deployment process runs through our CI tool again. And that CI process, the second time on the integration branch, will actually get all the Composer stuff ready to go. And then it will take the complete hosting artifact and push that up to the web server. So the web server doesn't actually have to have outbound internet connectivity. You just need a way to deploy those resources out to the web server so they're there and present. Next question, Virginia, if you're developing a new D8, should we go ahead and use PHP 7.4 or 7.3? My recommendation would be use 7.3. I have not personally made the jump to 7.4. I have heard from several folks that even though Drupal itself works great with 7.4, there may be some less than ideal side effects of running 7.4 with some modules. That's just feedback I've heard from people. I don't have a great answer for you there. I would say all of my projects are running 7.3 at this point. I haven't pulled the trigger on that one. I'm happy to hang out for another couple minutes if there are other questions. Otherwise, we are at 4 o'clock. So this is going to wrap up pretty quick if not. Last call for questions in chat.
Okay, I'm going to say thank you, Mike, for this thorough presentation. I think we all can take what you've shared and apply it to our current projects. I also want to mention that for our September webinar, we will be talking about our conference that will be held on the 24th and the 25th. We'll be sharing information about how-tos and just what's going on during the conference. And lastly, we will be sending out a survey after this webinar, so please fill it out. And thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, everybody.